The English language doesn't exist. It's just badly pronounced French. Those aren't my words, they're supposedly the words of this 20th century French statesman. And they're the name of a book by this French linguistics professor who thinks the English-speaking world should be grateful to France.
C'est grâce au français que l'anglais est international.
Is he right? How French is English after all? Let's find out in another Rob Words. So English is a Germanic language. Some people will try to tell you it isn't for reasons that will become clear, but it is. Old English was brought to the British Isles by Germanic tribes. It was closely related to the languages that became German and Dutch. And in fact, it's not totally ridiculous to claim that a modern-day German would have a better chance of understanding Old English than a modern-day Brit. Old English is really nothing like the English that we speak today. It had grammatical gender, you had to put words in a different order, and it had all these complicated variable endings for nouns, adjectives, and verbs. But a millennium and a series of historical events have changed our language completely. And perhaps the single biggest event was this. In 1066, the French arrived, specifically the Normans, and English would never be the same again. As Professor Cerquilini puts it in his book, without the Normans, English would today be a second Dutch. Would that be so bad? And the thing is, he's sort of right. When the Norman king William the Conqueror seizes the throne of England, he initiates a period of enormous linguistic change. He kicks out all the English nobles and replaces them with his pals. He sacks all the English bishops bar one and puts Normans in their place. And suddenly, anyone with any power in England is speaking French. And that remains the case for a few centuries. You know, one of England's most celebrated kings, particularly by English nationalists, Richard the Lionheart, spoke barely a word of English. That's if he spoke any English at all. So French was the language of the elite. It became the language of government, chivalry, and art. All French words, by the way. As a result, French words from these fields start to stream into the English language. You needed to know them to get anything done. And to this day, many of our words for power, justice, and culture are from French. Words like parliament, council, court, judge, prince, battle, painting, music. I could go on. And I will. Tax, bill, jury, prison, baron, duke, culture, theatre, mayor, minister. I could still go on. And I will. Words like attorney, rule, economy, faith, war, peace. I think you've got the picture. And what also happens is the names for traders and artisans start to change too. They take on more prestigious sounding French names. The Old English fleshmonger is replaced by the Old French butcher. The treewright becomes the carpenter. The chapman becomes the merchant. And we end up with barbers, drapers, grocers, masons, and tailors. All words from French. And the power dynamic between the lowly English and the Norman nobility is apparent even in our language today. We've ended up with two words for a lot of animals, an Old English-derived one for when they're alive and a French one for when they're served up for dinner. We have cow and beef, sheep and mutton, deer and venison, because the English would encounter them on the farm and the Normans would encounter them on the plate. You've perhaps heard all of that before. I'm by no means the first to point it out. In fact, Walter Scott tackled it way back in 1820 in Ivanhoe, his tale of an Anglo-Saxon noble family surrounded by Normans. In it, the jester, Wamba, says, "Old Alderman Ox continues to hold his Saxon epithet while he's under the charge of serfs and bondsmen such as thou, but becomes Beef, a fiery French gallant, when he arrives before the worshipful jaws that are destined to consume him. Mynheer Calf, too, becomes Monsieur de Vaux in the like manner. He's Saxon when he requires tendance, and takes a Norman name when he becomes matter of enjoyment." Many of our words for a fancy banquet come from French too. A servant may bring you your dinner or serve you a bottle with supper. Loads more of these coming up, but if all this talk of French has got you thinking, man, I really should get round to learning another language, allow me to help you out with that, because viewers of this video can get a special discount at Lingoda. Lingoda is a great place to learn a language because its approach is all about getting you speaking to real people as soon as possible. This is essential the way I see it, because from my own experience learning languages, the real learning starts when you actually begin to communicate. And Lingoda makes that so simple. You can easily find a group or private lesson that suits your skill level and your schedule. And each lesson comes with lots of great material.
Bonjour.
And the teachers are just great. I had a fabulous time.
Je suis Rob, je suis ici pour faire un petit leçon de français.
Lingoda is right now running a language sprint challenge. It's an intensive 60-day course aimed at getting you in a daily language learning habit and staying motivated. If you complete it, you can get 50% cash back.
And that combination of the live lessons, the intensity, and the promise of a reward are all designed to keep your learning on track.
Plus, if you go to my link below and use the code ROBWORDS20, you can get a €20 or $25 discount off the Lingoda Sprint Challenge. So check it out. Okay, back to the many French words in English. And like with the meets, our names for family members show the former prestige of the French language. Our closest family have Anglo-Saxon names: mother, daughter, father, and son. These words have all been with us since Old English. But niece, nephew, aunt, uncle, cousin, they're all French words. You need to be able to describe non-nuclear family members when it comes to matters of hierarchy and succession, but not necessarily when you're only ever handing the family farm down to the next generation. During this period, which we call the Middle English period, the appetite for taking French words is pretty much insatiable. In fact, in some cases, we even took the same French words twice, but in slightly different forms. William the Conqueror and his lot brought over a specific dialect of Old French, Norman French. It was spoken in northern France and was a version of French influenced by Germanic pronunciations. The Normans were essentially Vikings who'd settled in northern France and learned the lingo. It's what the word Norman means. But a bit less than a century after William first claims England for himself, the crown passes down to the Plantagenets, a dynasty that spoke a different dialect to William, one that came from central France. So check this out. When Norman French used a w sound at the start of a word, the central French dialect tended to use a g. The Normans made a k sound where their counterparts to the south made a ch, and they made a ch sound where Central French made a s. Now, during the Middle English period, English took on versions of the same word from both dialects, many of which remain with us today. We took, for example, both warden and guardian, warranty and guarantee, wage and gauge, catch and chase. Now, these words meant the same as each other, but when we took them on, we charged each with its own nuance. And that tactic of borrowing a word but giving it a slightly narrower meaning is a tactic that has helped make English the gloriously rich language that it is. Because instead of French words replacing Anglo-Saxon words, a lot of the time they sat alongside them. For example, we can still ask for something, but we can also demand it. We can answer and we can respond. We can wish and desire, begin and commence. We have the Anglo-Saxon versions and the French-derived versions. So English takes on vast amounts of French words during this Middle English period, but it also never really gets out of the habit, even after French stops being the language of the ruling class, a process that begins with the English crown losing Normandy in 1204 and ends arguably with the 100 Years' War between England and France, when speaking French in England was no longer de rigueur, but something of a faux pas. Over the centuries since then, we've continued to take on French words, mainly because French has always been a bit prestigious. It's fancy. So we've given various Anglo-Saxon nouns florid French adjectives. Things concerning the brain are mental, things in our house are domestic, and our towns are urban. A lot of that's just the result of a fashion in the 15th century. And as the professor points out, in the 18th century, a mania for all things French saw us borrow ballet, connoisseur, coquette, coterie, intrigue, and soubrette. I actually had to look up soubrette. Apparently it's a maidservant or lady's maid as a character in a play or opera, usually one of a pert, coquettish, or intriguing character. Pert. The upshot of all this is that it's now thought that just shy of 30% of the words in modern-day English come from French. That's huge. And if you take into account the Latin-derived words in English too, you see that the minority of English words are actually Germanic. On the face of it, that seems like a win for those who say English is more of a Romance language than a Germanic one. But not so fast, because what's important here is precisely which words come from where. Because yes, there are lots of French words in English in terms of raw numbers, but the vast majority of the words we actually use day to day are Germanic. Our core vocabulary is overwhelmingly from Old English. On this list of the 100 most frequently used words in English, only one of them is from French. And that's the word people, a word that we've recently handed back to the French and they're using to describe their celebrities. Actually, it's funny how French has started re-borrowing words that it gave to English in the first place. It's one of the big themes of Professor Sequilini's book.
La plupart des anglicismes que nous empruntons en ce moment sont en fait de vieux mots français. On le sait pour tennis, qui est tenez, au jeu de paume on envoie la balle.
His point is that French speakers should actually take heart in the fact that French has permeated the English language so deeply that English is now redistributing it to the rest of the world.
Organisation des Nations Unies. 3 mots français. L'anglais international, c'est du français. Soyez fiers.
Yeah, also United States. That's 2 words from French. States is an interesting one, actually. I dedicated a large chunk of a previous video to this next bit, but a surprising number of ST words in English have a modern French equivalent with E with an accent, T. In the case of state, it's état, but also stage has étage, stranger has étranger. That's because the old French versions of these words started with EST. English dropped the E and French dropped the S. So we may have put our own spin on them, but French words really are everywhere in our language, and undoubtedly vocabulary is the most profound way in which French has influenced English. But it's not the only way. The grammar of English has changed significantly since Old English, and a large amount of that change happened as the Normans arrived and Old English became Middle English. Now, it's hard to say exactly how much of this change is attributable to French influence. English, for example, has just come into a great deal of contact with the language of the Vikings, Old Norse, too. But there are at least a couple of changes for which French has to be the prime suspect. One of them is that we developed a second way to indicate that something belonged to someone or somewhere, and we still have both now. So nowadays we can say the king's sword or the sword of the king. The first of those reflects the Old English construction, and the second is applying the same formula as French does. It uses a word to suggest possession. In French, de, in English, of, instead of just adding letters to the end of whatever is doing the possessing, like Old English did. In Middle English, it also becomes possible to put an adjective after a noun, although it's not something we do that often these days. But we can still say, for example, move to pastures new instead of new pastures, or we can speak of time immemorial. This is a French construction that we also see in a lot of job titles like Attorney General, Procurator Fiscal, Notary Public, or when we speak of an heir apparent. And could it even be that the French changed the way we pronounce the words we already had? Almost certainly yes, because during the Middle English period, H's start dropping like flies to an horrible extent, especially at the start of words. In Old English, the words for lord and lady both began with an H. We also see H dropping that's more familiar to us now, i.e. H is being dropped before vowels, but far from it being something that was seen as a sign of a lack of education back then, as it occasionally is now, it was probably seen as the opposite. Because who's terrible at H's?
I would like to buy a hamburger.
To drop your H's was to sound more French and therefore more prestigious. This might even explain why H dropping is even now more prevalent in areas that were historically of administrative and commercial significance, like London and the southeast of England, because in areas that would have had much less French influence, people are less likely to drop their H's. Think about how some people in Scotland will say what or where. They're emphasizing the H's, if anything. And a remnant of this idea that dropping your H's like a French speaker is prestigious is the fact some people still insist on saying an hotel or an historic, effectively treating the H like it isn't there. I think perhaps some people think an historic is more poetic. Which brings me on to another profound change that the French are very likely responsible for. Let me show you something. This is Caedmon's hymn. Written sometime in the 7th century, it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, attested examples of an Old English poem. The key characteristic of this, and indeed all Germanic poetry from the time, is it contains amazing amounts of alliteration. It repeats the sounds at the starts of words over and over. Let's just have a listen to this marvellous reading by Kara Schallenberg. Note the alliteration, but also just see if you spot something else too.
Nu Schulan Herian, Herr von riches word, mehr to the smechte and his mod ye thank. Werk Wuldervader, swa he wonder gewees, each drichten, or unstelde.
So hopefully you heard the alliteration there, but did you also notice something else? It didn't rhyme. Now I know poetry doesn't have to rhyme, but in Old English it never did. It was all about the alliteration. Poetry in English only starts to rhyme after the French turn up. French poetry was known for its rhymes at the end of lines, and that becomes the fashion in England too. Without doubt, the best known writer of the Middle English period is Geoffrey Chaucer, and look at this. He ends every line with a lovely little rhyme. And Chaucer was well versed, so to speak, in French.
Chaucer travaille dans les douanes à Londres, il travaille en français.
Yeah, and in the Canterbury Tales, he's using a rhyming technique taken from across the English Channel. So our poetry, our grammar, our vocabulary, and the way we speak. The people of France can indeed claim a part in shaping English into the language it's become.
C'est grâce au français que l'anglais est international.
Well, maybe. Colonialism, Hollywood, and the internet might also have played their part though, right? Nevertheless, it seems to me that the sheer number of borrowed words in our language means we 1.5 billion English speakers around the world are at least some of the time just speaking badly pronounced French. If you've enjoyed this video, I think you should watch this one next, and if you can read French, check out the professor's book. It's actually really great. I've got a totally free newsletter about word facts and language fun in English. You should sign up to that, and I'll see you in the next thing. À la prochaine. Cheerio.